Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Zakarin, editor of the New Books Network. Today I'm speaking with Asad L, assistant professor of sociology at Stanford University. He's the author of Engage and Evade: How Latino Immigrant Families Manage Surveillance in Everyday Life. A highly relevant book, Engage and Evade documents the interactions between undocumented people and the agents and institutions of government. One might expect undocumented people to avoid the IRS, but as Asad demonstrates, many engage with government institutions in the hopes that positive interactions and compliance might help their immigration cases down the road. Published in 2023, Immigration Policy and Treatment of Undocumented People by the Government has shifted dramatically in a short time. I'm grateful today to be able to speak with Asad about this thoughtful book. Asad, thanks for joining me today on the New Books Network.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, I'm kind of, normally say I'm glad to speak with you, but I'm kind of not glad to speak with you because I don't want this book to be relevant. I think, I'm from California, I'm from Los Angeles, and it's, just being from LA, you get to know a lot of people that are in these sort of confusing legal situations. And, there are people that, they're law-abiding citizens who are just trying to go about their lives and are trying to contribute in the ways that they can. And many times, they're coming here for the reasons that, that anyone does, which is basically to try and make a better life for their families. And I think this book is really interesting because it sheds a light on a really interesting aspect of how immigrant families navigate the legal system and how they navigate the government. But before discussing the book, I was wondering if you could just introduce yourself a little bit and tell the listeners about who you are and your background.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say this off the top, which is if I could destroy the book in exchange for sort of pathway to peace for all families documented in the book and all the families sort of in a similar situation, I absolutely would. But I sort of begin the book from this idea of my own story as the son of Palestinian immigrants to the United States. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where, I spent a lot of time in diverse Milwaukee public schools. I learned a lot from a diverse cadre of students who I was lucky to call friends and classmates. And, I think the question of immigration always surrounded me, not just in my immediate family, my broader neighborhood, but certainly in the everyday interactions I had with students and their families in the schools that I grew up in. And I think eventually, as I got to graduate school, I started investigating this question that I saw portrayed over and over and over again in existing academic research, which was this idea that immigrants, particularly those who are undocumented, are always in the shadows. They're hiding, they're on the run, they're avoidant of everyday behaviors that you or I, Caleb, might take for granted. And that framework, right, in 2011, 12, 13, when I'm entering graduate school, didn't really seem to hold water for me, or at least it didn't seem to capture the whole story. And so eventually, as I progressed through graduate school, as I started to think about my own research project, I came to the realization that I wanted to do a project about this dance, this dynamic of engagement and evasion that seems to typify so many immigrant families' lives. Although, there was it took over 10 years, I think, from the start of the field work to the publication of the book. So it looks and sounds very neat and orderly in the process as I'm narrating it here, but it took a while for me to figure out what that punchline was. And I think that time that it took me sort of reflects exactly that complexity of these real people's lives as they navigate this really precarious legal situation that they've lived in for, at least for the families in my book, 20 years at this point. And figuring out how to make it all work despite it's not supposed to. It's not supposed to work, so to speak, right? They're undocumented. They're not supposed to be able to lead their lives here in the way that we all assume that it's probably easier for us who have U.S. citizenship to be able to lead our lives. And ultimately what I found was things are tough. People have a hard time. But at the end of the day, they do a really good job of trying to balance the threat of punishment associated with their undocumented status and that hope for living to fight another day, waking up tomorrow, going to work, taking their kids to school, paying those taxes, being good citizens in their local neighborhoods. And I think that duality that they face every day really typifies so many of us. It's just the stakes feel very high for the particular families profiled in my book.
Absolutely. I'm really curious to learn more about that research, writing, reading process, because it does really come across in the book that there was an immense amount of work and thought and care that went into it. So, what was that like? What was it like conducting these interviews, and then also the reading and research that went into the project?
Yeah, the interview started as part of a larger project where I was a graduate research assistant. The principal investigators for that were Kathy Eden, who's now at Princeton, and Stephanie DeLuca, who is at Johns Hopkins University. And they were designing this larger study about how parents house kids. Do you sort of pick a nice neighborhood, so to speak, and live in a not so big house, but you pay a lot in rent and have a huge opportunities for your kids because there's a great public school district there, but perhaps you're farther away from work? Or do you live in a not so nice neighborhood? Maybe you get a much larger house for your buck, but the school districts are not so good, and all the trade-offs associated with that. And so this was a city. There are two cities, Dallas and Cleveland, and I opted into joining the Dallas team. I spoke Spanish. I thought it would be useful, although the study was not designed to think about anybody who was an immigrant per se. We were just looking for low, middle, and high income Black, white, and Latino families in Dallas and in Cleveland. And I sort of was assigned to study the majority of Latino neighborhoods throughout Dallas. So we would randomly select addresses within previously identified neighborhoods that we selected, and you'd go door knocking. And you sort of go and you say, "Hi, my name is Asad. I'm part of this larger study. Would you like to participate?" And I think one thing I talk about in the book is just how weird that of an experience that is for a lot of people. I think many of us, and perhaps the people listening, have never quite encountered someone who just kind of shows up and is willing to have a 2 to 3 hour conversation with you about your life story. But that's exactly what we offered these families in the book. And so I started in 2013. Turned out of the 36 or so Latino families identified, about 28 had at least one immigrant householder. And so I went back to graduate school after 2013, talked to my advisor. I said, there's a really interesting process at work in Dallas. We weren't looking for immigrant families, but it turned out a large majority of the Latino families interviewed were, in fact, immigrant households. And so I wanted to study that grouping of families, in particular because so much of the research to date had looked at the experiences of immigrants, particularly the undocumented, who were selected from legal aid clinics, who were selected from nonprofits, selected from their experiences in immigration court, all of which give one lens into the dynamics of surveillance and social control that these people are experiencing, because they are enmeshed within it. They're interacting with people who can teach them their rights, who can tell them about all of their obligations to society and society's obligations to them. But I think what was special about this group that I was able to interview is they're just recruited from their everyday residential environments. So all the messiness associated with everyday life is there for people who may or may not be connected to nonprofits, to lawyers, they may or may not have removal experiences or deportation experiences. But I think that's exactly why I wanted to study this group. And so in 2014, I went back. In 2015, I went back, and then I think I sort of understood generally what the story was, I felt like. And then we had the first surprise election, perhaps of many of our lifetimes. And so the first Trump administration came into power. And I went back into Dallas in 2018 to follow up with the families in my book. And then I was writing throughout 2019 and 2020, and really was trying to piece together, kind of like I was saying at the outset, how do I make sense of all of these dynamics that I'm seeing where people are telling me that, yeah, they're not super afraid of deportation, and yet in other moments, they're also telling me they are afraid of deportation. How do I make sense of, in one moment, they're avoidant of surveilling institutions like the police, but in other moments, they are interacting with the police department as they pay tickets, or even flagging down a police officer on the street to ask him to look up whether I have an outstanding ticket for a traffic infraction, which is the story for one of my respondents. And so it took a while, I think, for me to be able to balance that dynamic of engagement and evasion. But then I think the other part that I didn't want to lose in the book was the fundamental humanity of the people that I interacted with. And so much of the book is propelled forward by real stories from real people who, I'm a sociologist. These real people stand in for broader, bigger processes, ideas, but I didn't want to lose the people for the ideas. And so I think so much of the book tries to balance the people with the process, to show how people exemplify bigger ideas. And in particular, this idea that you are so much more than your weakest link, right? So if you are undocumented, that doesn't mean that your whole life is just about you being undocumented, because you're also a parent. You're also a child yourself. You're the son or daughter of, some parents whom you're trying to take care of. So I think so much of the writing of the book was about finding a way to communicate people's real stories, real experiences, while also recognizing just how severe the political context was that they're generally operating in. And this political context, and I'm happy to talk more, it's sort of more than any one person or administration, right? This sort of political context has always been there, as long as these families know, right? Many of them entered under the the second Bush administration, and then were here throughout the first Obama and second Obama terms, and all of them were still here during the first Trump administration. And so then the question becomes, how do people in these larger, changing, seemingly ever evolving dynamics of immigration and immigration enforcement make sense of what life looks like? Because I live locally, and yet my fear might be national. I might be afraid of what Trump or Obama are doing, but I live here. I don't live everywhere, right? And so I think trying to keep the dynamics of the national environment alongside the state and local environment in mind, while writing, also was one of my big challenges. But I think I was able to tell a story where people are actually much more sophisticated at being able to uncover what's going on in the White House versus what's going on here, and trying to make sense of what all of these dynamics mean for what my life can look like at the moment.
Recently, there have been some highly publicized ICE raids, some targeting people that have been accused of violent crimes or drug distribution, but also just some families that, happen to have made the mistake, or, they thought at the time made the mistake of interacting with the government, so that now people know, actually know where they are. There's this kind of irony that I think is sort of at the heart of this book, that the people that are in the United States and are undocumented, who actually are trying to make a good go out of it, are now the people that might be at the most risk. Because if someone's coming into this country to try and commit a crime, they probably aren't going to try and interact with government institutions. So I was wondering if you could just kind of do a bit of a comparison. What are things like now compared to maybe when you first started this project for undocumented people?
Yeah, this question is always a doozy, because I think one thing I try to communicate to folks is so much of what we're seeing now has long been possible. So much of what we're seeing now, the infrastructure was built up during the first Obama administration. It was, spread nationally during that Obama administration. It was then that same infrastructure was then taken advantage of by the first Trump administration. And then that infrastructure remained on the books virtually unchanged during the Biden administration. And that same infrastructure exists now to threaten the same lives and livelihoods of the very people we're talking about. And so what I try to say is so much of what we're seeing is a reflection of bipartisan agreement on immigration enforcement. And we need to name that, we need to recognize that, because when we sort of focus on a particular actor or a particular party, we sort of overlook the broader dynamic here, which is both parties are very much in agreement, actually, that immigration enforcement is the first and foremost mechanism that we should use to quote unquote manage the undocumented population. Full stop. Having said that, obviously the character of what immigration enforcement looks like under the current Trump administration relative to even the Biden administration it's night and day. I mean, it feels night and day. And so much of that feeling is relevant to the families profiled in my book, right? So much of their dances between institutional engagement and institutional evasion are predicated on the predictability of immigration enforcement. Knowing that, okay, so long as I myself am engaged in good behaviors, whatever I might imagine those good behaviors to be, I should be okay. ICE doesn't target people like me. And that policy has basically been on the books for the last 10 to 15 years. What the Trump administration does, historically and today, is it unsettles that sort of heuristic that people internalize throughout their time here. And I think that unsettling is where you start to see more evasion rather than engagement. And so much of the book, I try to describe that what I'm describing here for people interviewed between 2013 and 2018 reflects a very particular moment, right? 2013, the Obama administration was transitioning toward the prioritization of people with criminal records. 2018, when I interviewed folks during the Trump administration, they knew that something was different. It felt different, and yet the underlying logic of immigration enforcement, at least locally, felt the same to a lot of the people in the book. And yet there was still, one or two examples of a family who had uprooted and moved to Mexico because they were just terrified by what the first Trump administration portended. But I think ultimately, when we think about sort of highly visible, high profile immigration enforcement, especially that which occurs under the Trump administration, we recognize that so much of what this administration is doing is reminding people very actively of this long-standing machinery and honestly taking credit for this long-standing machinery. Look, we are so tough on immigration enforcement. Here's all of what we can show you on our Instagram demonstrating how tough we are, right? And these men that they removed they extradited, let's be clear, or we'll call it, they rendered to, El Salvador, many of whom just have tattoos of autism awareness and, in support of their parents and, other kinds of tattoos I saw recently online. That I think is an extreme example of, enforcing immigration law without regard to the rights and dignity of the people whom you're subjecting to the laws. No one there had come in to cause any ruckus. Most people don't come in anywhere to cause any ruckus, right? And I think one of the key points that I try to outline in chapter 1 is, we want our immigrants here in the United States to be law-abiding and good, decent people. Do we assume that nobody was a law-abiding, decent person in their country of origin, right? People are born and raised and socialized in a different context. Many of these contexts also have laws and policies that align with the laws and policies that we in the United States sort of impose on everyone in this country. And so the key difference here is when you transpose from, let's say, Mexico to the United States and you're undocumented, the stakes of that compliance with the law increase, but the actual laws that you need to follow don't feel substantially different to you. Because of course I'm not going to come into your house and jump in your bed because it's your bed. Why would I cause a mess in your house, as one of my respondents told me? And so I think the expectation that, immigrants must be superlative on all dimension is sort of it feels very American in the way that we sort of project all of these high standards onto these immigrants, many of whom are entering already being, as unimpeachable or even more unimpeachable than the typical American citizen. And, rather than sort of foreground and reward people for doing all they can to be good citizens in all ways except on paper, right? Based on whether they have a U.S. citizenship, a U.S. passport or not. I think by not recognizing the fundamental goodness in most immigrants, in particular the undocumented immigrants, I think we construct a world in which we allow this kind of criminalization to happen. We sort of scapegoat immigrants. We have a president who comes in and scapegoats immigrants to score some cheap political points. But we sort of ignore the fundamental reality, which is these people are fundamentally human, and the humanity that they bring with them from Mexico, from somewhere in Central America, is a shared humanity that we in the United States, we the people in the United States also have. And my hope is the book and the broader takeaways of the book remind people that actually there's way more here that unites us in terms of whether we're undocumented or US born citizens, in terms of our shared commitment to taking care of ourselves, our families, and our loved ones without sort of causing too much trouble for anyone. We don't want to be a burden. We don't want to ask for too much help. Many immigrants feel that way all the time. Many American citizens who are not immigrants feel that way all the time. And I think putting those pieces together is kind of the fundamental conclusion of the book.
Yeah, it's the whole reason for why, obviously there are millions of undocumented people in the country, so there, and many of them have been here for decades, and they come for all sorts of different reasons. Obviously a lot of the people that come, they're doing it not because they are escaping a dangerous environment. What was your sense when you talked to the various people that you spoke with? Why they said that they came to the United States?
Yeah, I certainly some people were fleeing a dangerous environment, but that was by far the least common reason among the people that I interviewed. And so I think, people would fall into maybe 3 or 4 buckets. Bucket 1 is your typical employment scenario. I came here to work for a better life for my family. Bucket number 2 is education. I came here for better educational opportunities in the United States. Bucket number 3 would be your humanitarian reasons, right? I'm fleeing violence or persecution in my home country. And then bucket number 4, I think I like to call it sort of real life, which is that some people's family members, their parents had left already and lived in the United States as undocumented immigrants. And they didn't necessarily want to come join their parents. They didn't want to live in the United States, but their parents basically said, hey, we found someone who can bring you in. We miss you. Come on, let's go. And that's essentially the short of it. And I think there's also the story of just, really bad breakups that you experience in your home country, right? And you might live in a small village and you don't want to see the boyfriend anymore. And so you decide you're going to go to the United States. And it feels, maybe some listeners, that excuse or that justification for migration feels so small given how hard immigration is to the United States. But you got to remember the context here, which is there's over 100 years of movement of people between Mexico and the United States. For a lot of people, it's actually kind of very simple, despite all the border security, to find your way in. Part of that is because there are networks of coyotes or smugglers who can bring you in. But on the other hand, there's also, for a lot of people who have visas, tourist visas, a border crossing card, you can just walk across the border with authorization, as was the case for this person who fled her hometown because she didn't want to see her boyfriend anymore or her ex-boyfriend anymore. And I think that reality is something that I think maybe downplay in the immigration space generally. We want to say that, here are people who have very strong affirmative reasons to come to the United States. Life is so much worse in their home country. And that is completely true. We should not dismiss those things. But I also think that we need to expand our definition of what is a legitimate reason for migration. And I think that it is also valid for this one person in my study who wanted to migrate because she didn't want to see her boyfriend anymore in her hometown. I think that is a completely valid reason for leaving. And so in the academic speak of it all, I say that people migrate in response to deprivation, this sort of perception, whether that something is missing in your homeland or your hometown that you might be able to get elsewhere. And so it could be financial security, educational security, job security, or even just this kind of emotional security of not having to see your ex everywhere you went. And so I think of this broader framework when outlining why people migrate. And I don't sort of upweight or downweight any of the justifications. I sort of take them as they are and think of them as, as equally legitimate reasons for why people might offer their reasons for migration.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good that's a good addition to kind of explanation of just the variety. I mean, in many ways, it's if it wasn't for the and not everyone agrees with this, but if it wasn't for the artificiality of national borders, it's just kind of like moving from California to Utah or something like that because you want to get a new start. And obviously there's a lot of opportunity in the United States. There's a lot of reasons to come in the same way that everyone that I knew that graduated college moved to New York.
Yeah. Yeah. And in some ways the move from Mexico to the US can be shorter than the move from California to New York, right? I think in some cases the movement within the US is a much longer distance than the movement from Mexico to Texas, depending on where you're coming from.
Right. Yeah. What I find really interesting is this and almost novel, but I'm not an expert on this field, so maybe it's been a well-trodden path, and you can tell me that. But I find this exploration of interactions with government institutions like the IRS, with the police, the DMV, that's very fascinating. So how does that work for how do the undocumented people navigate these institutions?
Yeah. So my hope is that this is among the most novel parts of the book, right? This chapter 2 and the following chapter 3, which really focuses on interactions with welfare bureaucracies on behalf of one's children. I think for a lot of people that I interviewed, so much of interaction with the government begins in, shortly upon arrival. So think about it this way. If I'm 16 years old, I've now just entered the United States. I haven't quite graduated from high school. My parents want me to finish school in the US. And so I enroll in public school because everyone, regardless of citizenship status, has access to K through 12 education in the United States, right? So there's one pathway in. Another pathway in is simply just learning about what life looks like here in the United States. And so for a lot of people, they weren't the first in their families to arrive. They were often following someone else, right? By the time I did the study, the migration flows from Mexico and Central America were well established. And so people had extensive networks that they could rely on to teach them what it means to interact with the U.S. and its institutions without being super scared. And so most people come to work. How do you find a job? And so some people learn very quickly that you find a job by getting what are called false identity documents, seguros chuecos, because you need to have you need to fill out paperwork in order to be able to get a job, right? And so you usually get a fake ID and a fake green card, and then you write in that social security number from the fake green card on your job application, and then you get the job, and then you start to do everything by the books because you kind of had to break the law to get the job, right? You can't work without the paperwork that says you can work, and then to offset the commission of that act, you try your best to pay taxes, and the IRS, somebody teaches you that the IRS lets you file taxes even if your name and social security number don't match. And the IRS even updated its systems to allow for these kinds of mismatches to occur because in PowerPoint presentations that they give in communities nationwide, they say there might even be immigration benefits to paying your taxes. And so I think a lot of the time, these ideas sort of diffuse through the networks. People start to learn, oh, okay, yes, we had to do this bad thing to get the job, but there's a way to offset that. And the IRS is instructing us on how to be good, moral citizens, despite the fact that we're denied work authorization. Other ideas come up with the police, right? So people have an understanding of who the police are in their countries of origin. Many people see the police in the US is actually much better than the police forces that they're dealing with back home. And so they see that the police exist to generally help you, especially relative to their perceptions from the police officers in their hometowns sometimes. And so there's a lot of community policing that people go door to door. The officers try to tell them, hey, if there's a crime, we want to help you, call us, we're not going to deport you. And these kinds of sort of micro level interventions actually do help a lot of the time. And then there are just, I think, the kinds of basic ways of learning. And so there's this great story of a respondent, Maite, who calls the IRS directly. She wants to file, she wants to be in good standing in the United States, isn't aware exactly if she even should file her taxes. So she calls the IRS helpline and just asks them all the 5, 10, 15 questions she had, and ultimately concludes oh yeah, I should be paying taxes. And I think when you recognize that there's an infrastructure here of participation in government institutions like the IRS, like the police, like the workplace, you try to find a way. You find your way around this infrastructure so you can be in good standing as much as you can. Now, I think on the flip side, you also want to make sure you're not in bad standing, right? And so you don't want to commit crimes. And I think it's almost well versed now that nobody wants to burden the government. Nobody wants to be a public charge, that they rely primarily on public assistance to make ends meet. And so a lot of people, especially shortly upon arrival, just kind of say, I'm going to do my work. I'm going to get my job. I'm going to pay my taxes, but I don't need personally any kinds of public benefits. Those are not available to me. I'm undocumented. And so I think that's kind of where I end chapter 2. And then I kind of pick up in chapter 3, sort of thinking about these other institutions, which are primarily welfare institutions, which again, people should not be interacting with for themselves. But it turns out we recognize in this country that we inflict a tremendous hardships onto undocumented parents. And so a lot of the times, the people in my studies started interacting with welfare bureaucracies when they discovered they were pregnant. And, that was, I think, one of the most surprising, and often it was the women, the pregnant parents who did it. But I think the most surprising thing to me was people would show up to an ER or an urgent care clinic and they had stomach pains, and then they discovered that they were pregnant, and the nurse or the social worker on site would help them enroll in the children's health insurance program, which offers prenatal care visits and 2 postnatal care visits for the pregnant parent, uh, because they ostensibly have an interest in protecting the well-being of the unborn child, right? The government does, who will eventually be a U.S. citizen. And I think from there, it kind of just escalates, right? Sort of you have to not just take care of the unborn baby as the parent, but once the baby is born, the baby needs their vaccination, the baby needs to go to school, the baby needs to be growing at a particular rate, the baby needs to, you need to attend parent-teacher conferences. And I think that's where you start to see these microdynamics of surveillance, especially over the children, come into play, because when you're undocumented, you generally have a low income, you're generally a racialized ethnic minority, and so the overlap between being undocumented, being poor, and being Latinx in the United States, these are all sort of red flags here for what we know to be risk factors for state-sanctioned surveillance against minoritized and low-income populations. So here you have well-meaning teachers and social workers and doctors who are watching the well-being of the children. And the parents are all trying their best. But every so often, life happens when you're undocumented. You just don't have enough money to pay the bills. And so the kid comes to school hungry. The teacher says, "Oh, wouldn't you like, SNAP assistance, colloquially food stamps?" And these are benefits that the parents had long been avoidant of because they are not personally eligible for them. And so they try to deflect and say, no, no, I don't need that. But at the insistence of the teacher or the social worker, they end up taking them on behalf of their kids. And so they're making a calculation here, which is, if I listen to the teacher, I can maybe stave off a report to Child Protective Services, which might lead to like police violence or police escalation and a different kind of family separation, right? A family separation where the kid is removed from my home because they accuse me of being an unfit parent, rather than the family separation we typically think about with undocumented families, which is deportation, right? And so I think people are making this trade-off that in the short term I can get these benefits. It might be a risk for me to get these benefits on behalf of my kids, because maybe the federal government decides one day that I could be deported or denied a legalization opportunity because of this. But as we mentioned earlier, because so many of these families have been here for 10 to 15 years, they said, well, I don't think a legalization opportunity is coming anyway. So I might as well take care of my kids, make sure that they're well provided for, and see what happens. And I think that's the conclusion a lot of people make.
Right. Yeah. One thing I want to pick up on that I think is an interesting sort of maybe outcome is that, so they'll have a job, they'll have the social security number, which is not their social security number, but they're paying taxes because obviously the IRS wants to collect as much tax as possible. But so they're paying into social security. Of course, they're not going to receive any social security benefits down the line. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the only reason Social Security is solvent is because of the contributions that undocumented immigrants make that they will not be able to benefit from down the road.
Yeah, that's just a terrible irony, of course. But yeah, it's very fascinating when how you look at um, comes into play with their children, and of course the guardedness that is of course expected. Of course you want to be able to feed your child. You want to be able to take them to to get medical care, obviously, like especially in the first few years when it's really crucial. but of course you don't want to risk that. And I think what's concerning now is while some of the actions that have been taken recently, they're kind of just you know uh, shock and awe tactics. Maybe there doesn't seem to be any like real clear answer as to like what's actually going to happen to the millions of undocumented people in the United States. But obviously, it's probably going to lead to even more people not wanting to take advantage of things like SNAP for their children. Yeah, my question is, seeing now, like, are there any things that you would look at today if we were to continue working on this project, continue examining this subject, particular things that you would continue to look at, or maybe other research that people are doing that you find particularly relevant and important?
Yeah, I think this is always the tough question because, you know, you have to write a book, you have to finish the book, and the book is then a moment in time. And of course, time continues post publication. And so the question becomes, what is it exactly that we can do to maintain some of the good dynamics, perhaps, that I outline in the book? And what is it that we can do to avoid some of the bad dynamics that I outline in the book? And I think the answer comes down to, at the moment, almost everything sort of feels very local. And the power of the locality that you're in, and perhaps even the larger state context, ultimately is going to be, I think, decisive, certainly in the next few years. But I think it's always been decisive, at least for the last 10 to 15 years. And so one example would be thinking about what it means to live in, let's say, a place like the Bay Area, where I am currently, right? To be an undocumented immigrant in the Bay Area, the 9 counties that constitute the Bay Area, plus, you know, California more generally, feels like a very different experience than being perhaps an undocumented immigrant in, Texas as a state. But even within Texas, you know, Dallas is kind of like this liberal blue bubble where they're trying really hard to be welcoming toward all immigrants, even as the surrounding counties themselves may be a bit more antagonistic toward immigrants. And so I think, unfortunately, we are trending toward this time period where the local government, local actors, local institutions will be the front line of defense for immigrant rights and the rights of the communities that they're serving. And I say unfortunate because I think many of the problems I outline in my book are easily rectified at the federal level. It's just a question of having the political will and effort to do something to construct public opinion in a way that tells people, hey, we don't need to be afraid of undocumented immigrants. We don't need to be afraid of their children. We don't need to be afraid of our borders being overrun. This is all fear mongering. We need to recognize that people have adopted the United States as their home for whatever reason, and people in doing so have agreed to adopt, our laws, our ways of being, our ways of life, blah, blah, blah. And we're going to facilitate that for them. And I think, absent that kind of federal intervention, you can definitely make it work at the local level, so long as you have strong localities, local actors who are willing to stand up for their immigrant communities, right? We don't want them to crumble at the first sign of pressure from the federal government. And I think there's good examples of this where, we talk about the word sanctuary. I actually don't quite like the word sanctuary because I think it's a misnomer. I don't, so a sanctuary policy, at least the way I've defined it in the book, is any kind of policy that limits at least some police collaboration with ICE, period. It doesn't mean that those collaborations don't happen. It doesn't mean that the police are not turning people over to ICE. It just means those collaborations are limited in some way, right? Reserved for people with severe criminal records or something. And I think what we find in studies based on sanctuary policies, and we find that they actually do help quite a lot by helping to make immigration enforcement locally more predictable, more legible, more patterned, so that I, as an undocumented immigrant, know what's going to get me in trouble and what's not going to get me in trouble. We know that those policies work. And we also know that, building up immigrant affairs offices in the local mayor's office, to teach people what their rights are and to bring the perspectives of undocumented immigrants and communities into the halls of local government, all of that works. And so I think, absent a federal government that is willing to do something in support of immigrants and their families and American communities more generally, I think we have to rely on the local.
Yeah, yeah. I really do think that, I mean, I I do wonder if some of the policies that have been taken or some of the actions that have been taken will backfire, because I think that there's there's maybe an opinion that would be you might find among, the average American citizen, that, they want their country to be safe. They don't want people smuggling drugs. They don't want criminals. Um, but at the same time too, like, they also, like, don't want to see children, or, they don't want to see children separated from their parents. They don't want to see people that are just trying to make a living harmed. And I do think that part of the issue is there just aren't the vast majority of people that are undocumented in this country are not criminals. They're not people that are trying to hurt people. They're not drug smugglers. So once that fiction is kind of realized by a lot of people, I do think that it might lead to some shifts and some change. But until then, it definitely is a time where, I worry. I definitely worry for a lot of people in this country.
Yeah, I'm with you. I worry, but I also think that there's a lot of opportunity here for counter messaging, right? Right now, I think the messaging has been co-opted into this sort of drugs and fear and smuggling and this and that. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for an affirmative counter message, which is exactly as you described. These are people. They are, you know, just like you or me. They are trying their best to make ends meet every day. We are all sort of together in this environment, working hard for a better life. They are not the enemy. We need to look actually at upwards at the White House or politicians who refuse to do something to enact meaningful change to improve the lives of all Americans, including undocumented immigrants. I think where there's a lot of room for improved messaging, because it's not undocumented immigrants are not our enemies. In fact, many of the issues that undocumented immigrants are facing are the exact same labor issues, the exact same healthcare issues, the exact same sort of welfare issues that so many Americans of all economic stripes, especially low income and working class Americans, are facing. And so I think the second that messaging becomes clear, that there's an affirmative message that actually your fates are tied. The reason why undocumented immigrants are suffering are the same reasons that you're suffering. And that we have someone who is willing to enact that messaging at a national scale to try to turn public opinion, not just in favor of a legalization program, but in terms of or toward I think more affirmative rights for immigrants to access healthcare and dignity in the way that all Americans should be able to access healthcare and other forms of dignity. I think that is sort of the long-term vision I would like to see, a counter messaging to the fear, more affirmative, shared, linked fates between, low and working class Americans and low and working class undocumented immigrants, and really just all people who call this country home to begin with.
Well, I'm certain that you will continue to do really interesting work on this topic, and obviously, as far as expertise, like, you have obviously an immense knowledge on how these systems are navigated, and how people continue to navigate them. So I really do look forward to seeing the future work that you do on this topic. I'm glad we got to discuss this book. It's really a worthwhile book for anyone interested in this topic of immigration. Especially today, I do think that it provides a lot of background, and there's even if it's not necessarily up to the very minute, understanding the context, I think is just as important. So yeah, thank you so much for being a guest in the New Books Network. It was really wonderful to speak with you.
Thanks for having me, Caleb.